Hey all, Heretic here. Today in the Battlegrounds, we're going to be talking about dragons. We're going to talk about the various minions, spells, strategies we can use to cobble together a dragon board that'll hopefully help us get some wins. So let's not wait for it. Let's dive right in. Let's start with makes dragons unique. They don't really have a super unique mechanic, but what dragons have is a lot of start of combat effects. They have a lot of ways where they can gain these stats, and they're actually going to be, in some cases, permanent, which gives you a long-term scaling that really can add up and is quite effective when applied in enough volume. Just a question of how much of it you can find at the right time. Find these minions late, you're out of luck, but if you can get them early, they are super strong and you really can cobble together a really effective board. Now, an important thing to remember also when we get to all these minions that do this is the order of triggering. What I mean by this is things happen at the beginning of combat in a very specific order that can affect where you want to position or how you might want to counter a dragon board. First, the buffs from hero powers will go first, then hero powers that do damaging things will go off, and then minions will trigger. When minions trigger, they're always going to trigger from left to right. Always keep that in mind with positioning, left to right. You have them in the wrong order. If you have the guys who do this buff, this guy over here makes this buff do more, but you got the buff going first, and the guy who makes the buff better, who could give you extra triggers, is in the wrong position, gonna mess it all up. So make sure you position your minions from left to right in the order you want them to trigger. Let's do it. Let's get into the dragon minions. Now, right off the start, we're not gonna cover any minions that are just stat sticks. Do they have a lot of health? Do they have a lot of attack? Does it scale a little during combat? We don't care. Not really worth it. If you're not giving buffs, if positioning doesn't matter, there isn't some unusual trigger, we're not going to cover those. Also, if at any time you have any questions because there's been a patch, an update, take a look at the comments attached to this video. It will list all the changes for each individual minion based on that patch number. And also, if there's another video, it will probably give you directions from there on where to find any new content that's come out. Update this tribe if there's been a big change, assuming there isn't a whole new guide because it was a dramatic change. Let's start with the minions. Let's jump into those. Right off the bat, we're going to start with the Thousandth Paper Drake. This is a tier 2, 2/3 dragon. Start of combat, give your leftmost dragon +1, +2, and Wind Fury. Not a big stat bump. 1/2 isn't much. It's a combat buff, so it's temporary. It's not going to last permanently, but it also gives Wind Fury. A lot of dragons gain stats when they attack. A lot of other dragons are going to buff after you attack. So that Wind Fury can be very effective. Do you want this in the late game on your board? Probably not. But there's also a chance you might splash it on the late board just so you can give a permanent buff of Wind Fury to a dragon you might need for a combat. One turn, you're like, oh, I need it. Pop them in there. Give Wind Fury to your main dragon that you need it to have, and then cut the Paper Drake. It's just a temporary buff. Hopefully it's a permanent buff if you have the right situation and minions going, but if it's at least a temporary buff that wins the combat, who cares? Next, we have the tier 2, 2/3 Whelp Smuggler. This is a neutral that is only in dragon lobbies, but after a friendly dragon gains attack, give it +1 health. Now, important distinction, there are in combat buffs, which are temporary, so any minions that buff normally in combat will go away. And then there are permanent buffs in the shop phase, which this buff will become permanent with. It's a distinction that gets a little blurred with dragons because of all the dragons that can make these buffs permanent. Just remember that this accumulative effect can be quite big as you stack these together. Whelp Smuggler, I love it when I get one early. If I see 2 early, I'm definitely thinking about going dragons. If I triple this, I'm almost assuredly thinking about going dragons, at least. Maybe not if it's destructive, because if all I have is the Whelp Smuggler, why am I playing dragons? But if I've got a few other dragons and I got a golden Whelp Smuggler, I'm feeling pretty good because dragons usually are lacking health. This thing does a nice job at bumping that baseline health up. At tier 3, we have quite a few dragons. Let's start with the duos. Doting Dracthyr 4/3 dragon. At the end of the turn, give your teammates minions +1 attack. Not a big buff, not bad. 4/3 stat line isn't too shabby. You're buffing, what, 6, 7 minions +1 attack? It's a pretty good return. You're not going to get directly, but your teammate is, and that's pretty acceptable. Next, we have the Electric Synthesizer. This 3/3 dragon, Battlecry, give your other dragons +3/+1. Well, You got 3 dragons on the board, you drop this thing down, giving a 9/3 buff to your board. That's decently significant for a cycle. I think that's worth it in my book, depending what stage of the game you're in and what build you're going for. Synthesizer always just splashes in really well on a dragon board. Touch it down, give its buffs, kick it out. Roaring Rallier, on the other hand, is a dragon you might want to hang on to for quite a while. This 3/5 is whenever a friendly dragon attacks, give it +2/+1. That is a decent stat line. For starters, it's a 3/5 with nothing wrong with, and then it gives a 2/1 buff. Well, a lot of dragons have Wind Fury, potentially permanently. Every time they attack, that 2/1 buff they survive is significant. There's Divine Shields floating around. There's lots of ways that these stats can become permanent, and you can get a nice long-term accumulative buff from this. And in the early game, that buff is just decent. There's nothing wrong with that stat line and that buff. So Roaring Rallier, always worth picking up if you're playing dragons. Next, we have Kalecgos. Now, Kalecgos is one of the old school favorites. This poor thing has jumped multiple tiers, had stat line adjustments. It's all over the place. But as a 4/4 dragon, this permanently keeps your enchantments from combat. That means any buffs this thing gets in combat, stick with it forever. Divine Shield, Reborn, Wind Fury, just plus stats. Hell, you're playing Brucon. Do you want to give it Death Rattle, summon a token? You can do that. Kalecgos is seemingly not very good. You're like, oh, it's just a 4/4, but that permanent stat thing, you have a lot of minions giving buffs in the combat, really can add up, and getting some effective ones on this thing can really make the difference between a win and a loss. This is an entire build, folks. Kalecgos, don't sleep on. If you haven't tried it yet, it's a lot of fun to play. Next, we have Timecapn't Hooktail. This 1/4 dragon pirate is whenever you cast a tavern spell, give your minions +1 attack. Well, it's all of your minions, including itself. There are some spells that are very cheap, 1 gold. Some minions Battlecry give you spells. So certainly Timecapn't Hooktail can fit on your board. If you happen to have a Whelp Smuggler and you happen to have 3 or 4 other dragons, this can really add up, because whatever the buff that spell gives you, if it's attack buff to your whole board or whatever, you also have like Whelp Smuggler adding health to your board. Really makes a big difference, because dragons need health, and anything you can do to help make that go faster is a big deal. So Timecapn't Hooktail and Whelp Smuggler are a really nice pair if you can get them going. And if you thought tier 3 had some interesting dragons, wait till tier 4. Nightbane Ignited. This 6/3 undead dragon, taunt, death rattle, give 2 random friendly minions this minion's attack. That means when it dies, it's going to buff 2 other dragons the attack. Well, if you have a ton of triggers going off, if you have a ton of buffs being applied every turn, even if they're not permanent, that really can add up. But Nightbane Ignited can get really disgusting, because when you start getting multiples of these, when you start getting the ways to make them keep their own buffs permanently, that stats that they're moving around, that attack really adds up to a lot, and can be very disgusting. It'd be really intimidating. You're just throwing around hundreds of attack. Your board might not have much health, but you can easily get into the thousands with attack. Now, one of the monsters for one of the primary builds you'll see with dragons, the Persistent Poet. This 2/3 dragon, Divine Shield, adjacent dragons permanently keep your enchantments from combat. This is going to be the combo enabler that you're going to be using a lot if you're playing mid-range dragons. Basically, this thing sits next to 2 dragons. All those start of combat buffs trigger, your Nightbanes die, whatever happens, those buffs are just flying all around, landing wherever they may, and Persistent Poet makes it so they stick. They stay forever, giving you permanent value from all these buffs. Buffs that are, for the most part, meant to be temporary are now permanent and really do add up a lot. Persistent Poet doesn't keep the buffs themselves because, well, they don't have that ability. They give it to the minions next to them. So if you take a Persistent Poet and sit it next to a Persistent Poet, it can get disgusting. You really can throw a lot of stats around during the duration of the game and make them permanent. Those Nightbanes throwing out attack that just keeps getting bigger because you have 2 of them, one on either side of a Persistent Poet, suddenly are just scaling themselves and getting nastier and nastier. It really is a lot of fun to see how it can play out. There's a lot of RNG about where stats are going to land and what's going to happen, but Persistent Poet enables almost all of that universally. Just remember, don't put this next to your Kalecgos. There's no reason to. Kalecgos already has this ability, so put Kalecgos somewhere completely different from Persistent Poet. Next, we have the prized Promo Drake. This tier 4, 5/4 dragon is start of combat, give your other dragons +3/+3. That is the downside. Prize Promo Drake, never going to buff itself. Going to buff every other dragon on the board. And if you already have Persistent Poet, those stats are going to stick. Do you have Kalecgos? Now they're sticking. Still not a crazy buff, but a 3/3 buff long enough. You get multiples of these, you get a gold one. Really does add up. So Prize Promo Drake is definitely worth picking up. Just a question of how many of these do you want to have. Typically, I never go more than one golden one if I can help it. I've seen people try doing more. Just doesn't feel quite fast enough to me, and there's so many dragons you want to have. Typically, I sit at just one set of golden Prize Promo Drakes if I can when I'm doing this build, but if you find enough of them, go nuts. Finally, we have Guzzle the Goop on tier 4, and that is a 4 gold spell. At the end of your turn, give your dragons +4 attack. Last 3 turns. Now, this is a permanent buff of 4 attack. It's going to last 3 turns. That's 12 attack for 4 gold. That's not bad if you're playing a dragon board. It certainly doesn't hurt you because more attack is great. If you have a Nightbane, that's permanent buffs to the Nightbane, which means Nightbane's throwing around more random attacks. And if you have Persistent Poets, now those random attacks are sticking around, so you're getting more accumulative value. So if you're going for these dragon builds, definitely look at Guzzle the Goop. For 4 gold, it's not a bad investment. It just takes a little bit of time to stick. Guess what? Tier 5 is even busier with dragons. We have things like the Amber Guardian, a 7/7 dragon that start of combat, give another friendly dragon +7/+7, and Divine Shield. You have Persistent Poets to make these buff permanent. You have a Kalecgos. Do you want them to have Divine Shield forever? First of all, 7/7 stat line's not bad. Giving a 7/7 buff in Divine Shield is crazy good. This makes the build work. This is one of the things you want to have. Amber Guardian is just a lot of fun to watch that shield bounce around. Hopefully landing on the minion you need to get Divine Shield, and not always the one who's not next to the Persistent Poet, but just a good card in general, something you definitely want to splash on the board. Next, we have the 8/3 Naga Dragon Draconic Deathscale. Spellcraft, trigger a friendly minion's battle cry. The value from this is pretty easy. If you have a good battle cry, you can now trigger it extra times. You play it, it triggered. Deathscale, it triggers. You can keep triggering it every turn if you want to keep this on the board. If you have a good enough battle cry, a golden something or other, and you want to generate lots of extra value, you sit a Deathscale on your board and you just occasionally trigger it. Maybe you don't even keep the Deathscale. Maybe you just cycle the Deathscale in and out to get that spellcraft. Either way, the value from it is easy to explain. Definitely want this if you have a good battle cry to get those extra triggers. Next, we have General Drakkisath. This 2/8 dragon is battle cry, get a 2/1 Smolder Wing with battle cry, give a dragon +5 attack. You're getting a 2/8 that gives you a 2/1 that buffs something 5 attack. You're getting 2 battle cry triggers. You're getting a nice big attack buff, which you can apply to any minion you need. I don't know, let's just say you had a Nightbane and you want to give it more attack to throw on all of your other dragons. Throw that 5 attack on there. And since it's 2 minions for the price of 1, basically sell this, all of it, and you only paid 1 gold to get the benefit of 2 battle cries and the attack buff, depending what kind of build you're running. I like General Drakkisath a lot. This is one of those cards I'll consider sitting on my board and just continuously triggering that battle cry, because yeah, if you can get 3 of these Smolder Wings, they will triple, and then you will get the better attack buff and you'll get the triple reward. Definitely, General Drakkisath, worth your time, even if it's just a cycle for the attack. Next, we have Murozond, an old favorite of mine. 5/5 dragon, battle cry, get a plain copy of a minion from your last opponent's warband. The last person you just fought have a card you'd really like to grab? Maybe they're playing the same build as you. Maybe it's your next opponent. You hang on to this for a turn. Murozond is going to allow you to get one of their 7 cards. I think I throw them and have a tier 7 and you just want to go for it. Do you have a brand? Because now you get a chance to get 2 copies of whatever card you get. Murozond is random. You're never going to get exactly what you want, but it is fun. This definitely would be one of the cards that you just keep on your board. Keep triggering its battle cry randomly, just trying to get lucky and pull the thing you need. Some games, it gives you nothing. In other games, it gives you everything. Next, we have Yulon Fortune Granter. This 8/8 dragon is a nasty minion for its effect. Start of combat, make your lowest tier minion golden, except for Yulon Fortune Granter. It can't buff itself or another minion up with the same name. But whatever lowest tier minion you have is going to be gold. You know what it is, and you can position it next to a persistent poet. If it's a Terragosa, those are permanent if you can get the positioning right. So definitely try to get things going here where you can get as much value as you can. But if you're doing that mid-range dragon build and you can get a Yulon on your board early, you start making those buffs permanent, and then you get the extra value from all these cards being gold. Now we come to tier 6. We start with the Hoarding Hatespawner. This is a 10/10 dragon, start of combat, steal 10/10 from the highest health enemy minion. It's a 10/10 buff to itself. It is not an insane steal. Yes, it can kill a minion if their highest health minion has less than 10 health, but it's still a good minion. And if it can get that buff permanently, you have all the other triggers going off, you're at least growing up a 10/10 every turn. It's not crazy. Do I want to go to 6 for this minion? No. Will I triple into 6 and consider keeping it? Depending on the board, quite possibly, yes. Finally, the granddaddy of dragons, Kalecgos Arcane Aspect. This 4/12 dragon is, after you trigger a battle cry, give your dragons +1/+1. That used to be incredibly good. It still can be good in the right circumstances, but it is slow now. It was potentially slow back in the day. It's kind of the situation where you always kind of want to have 2 Kalecgoses or a Kalecgos and a brand, and then hey, just start golding either one, who cares? But it is kind of slow in the current days. It hasn't aged as well as some other things, and it definitely can be times where it's frustrating. When you see someone win with a Kalecgos, you almost want to high-five them and say, hey, thank you for that flashback in time, because wow, this doesn't work as much anymore. But Kalecgos, you definitely can build a win around if you get them early enough and with the right combination of cards. Finally, we have the Obsidian Ravager. This tier 7, 7/7 is whenever this attacks, deal damage equal to its attack to the target and an adjacent minion. What this means is it is going to first deal its attack to the minion it's attacking and a random minion next to it, left and or right, completely random. And then it will hit it if that target is still alive. So if it has Divine Shield, it will knock off the shield and then it will punch it. But if it kills it with this ability, then you don't have to worry about any attack from the minion that you're about to hit. It just dies. Got Venom? You don't care. Leroy? You're still dead. But you took it out early, right? It felt good. It felt good for a second. Obsidian Ravager is a very fun card if you can scale it up a lot. Currently, you can only get this if you're playing the hero Thorum, but you can steal it from him. You can find some other shenanigans to get a copy on your board. It is a lot of fun to play with when you can buff it a good bit. All right, let's do it. Let's talk builds. Let's talk about the builds we want to use with dragons and how we can make this stuff work. You know all the different minions. Let's talk about the combinations. Now, my first one we're going to talk about is the old school one, which still can work, and that's a Kalecgos Battlecry build. It's very simple. You want to have Kalecgos, and you want to trigger a lot of battle cries. So what are the main pieces of this build? To me, it's going to be Kalecgos. Kalecgos is going to be the buff, all of your board. You need to have Kali to make the Kalecgos build work. Next would be Bran, because Bran is going to give you extra triggers of that battle cry, which is going to make Kalecgos give you extra stats to the rest of your board. Next, I would say probably Draconic Deathscale would be the one I would want the most, because that way you get a targeted buff of whatever the most important one you want to trigger every turn is, followed by, if I had to choose, it would be General Drakkisath. The reason for that being is Drakkisath is going to be able to give you a Battlecry minion. Well, he's a Battlecry himself. Then he gives you a Battlecry minion, and then you can just keep generating enough of those so you can get a triple. Another option, if you don't have Draconic Deathscale, you could use a Young Murkai. That could sit next to General Drakkisath and trigger every turn, giving you good value. The only issue with that is it's a Murloc, thus it is not benefiting from any of the stats your Kalecgos is throwing around, but it certainly can work in a pinch. Other things we can use to fill out that board, really, it's your choice. Any dragon you want can fit this board, benefit from those stats, and help get you the win. I would say probably my favorite would be Nightbane. The reason for that is relatively simple. Nightbane is benefiting wholly from all of these buffs that you're getting thrown around by Kalecgos. And then when Nightbane dies, it's buffing your other minions with high attack to help you win fights. Really, that is the build. You have this main piece, you have this optional little side piece you can get, and then anything else you want to fill it in. The problem is so much of this build is tier 6 and 5 that it can be daunting. You really do have to get lucky and hit these individual pieces to make this build really work. The old days where you could just have a Kali and a Bran, it's just not fast enough unless you get really lucky. Now let's talk about our combat buffing build for dragons. This one's a little more fun to play because it's all mid to low tier minions you need. There's not really much you have to cobble together other than hit these. Obviously, if you're playing a hero like Ysera, this is going to be a lot easier than if you're just playing a hero that randomly finds them in the shop and gets lucky. But if you do, let's look for the main pieces of this build that we want. Then we can figure out what else we want to fluff into it, because there's a lot of dragons that can fit in this build. That's kind of the problem. You're going to find so many, you're going to be like, shit, which one do I cut? At some point, you're going to have to cut some of this, but the main ones you need are first going to be Persistent Poet. That is going to make it so these buffs are permanent. So you position them next to the minion you want to keep these buffs forever, and that is huge. Positioning matters more than anything else in this combat. Then we're going to look at things like Nightbane, the Ignited. Nightbane is going to be throwing around a lot of attack, which allows your Persistent Poet to let those other minions absorb that attack. Persistent Poet's pretty durable since it already has a Divine Shield. Any of those attacks that land on it lets it do some extra attack. And finally, after the nerf, I would say the most important minion is Amber Guardian. The reason for that being the last piece of the main minions you need, because that's going to give you a Divine Shield buff that your Persistent Poet is going to make permanent. It'll never buff itself, the Amber Guardian, so you don't have to worry about that. This is probably one of those minions you're going to cut eventually. Once everything's got Divine Shield, no real reason to keep the Amber Guardian. You might as well cut it at that stage, but then you're in a pretty good position already, so don't complain. So we have the main pieces. We have our Amber Guardian, we have our Persistent Poet, we have Nightbane. Hopefully we have 2 Nightbanes sitting around a Persistent Poet. That way they can absorb up those extra attack buffs, and they can throw those around even more. And then we're going to look at all the other stuff. So what do we build this build out with? What are the pieces we want to flush it out with? Yu'lon's great. Yu'lon is a very good minion to add temporarily. Probably not the whole game, because once everything's gold, why worry? But they're going to make your lowest tier minion gold. Unfortunately, you might have multiple minions that are all low tier of the same tier, so you can't decide which one it's going to be. It's going to be random, but try to position as well as you can with your Persistent Poet. Roaring Rallier is going to give you a nice stat bump every time one of your minions attacks. If they already gain permanent stats, why the heck not? Kalecgos. Kalecgos will absorb all these buffs permanently. You don't have to put Kalecgos next to a Persistent Poet. So you don't have to find every Persistent Poet in the lobby. You just have to find a couple of them and then a couple Kalecgoses. Then you can absorb a lot of value without having to worry about the positioning quite as much. Prize Promo Drake. This one is going to buff all of your other dragons on the board 3/3. It's simple. Nothing complicated about that. It is not going to buff itself, whereas the problem might lie with this minion, but you can always use it as a bumper if it never really gets to a size where you care about it. If anything, just to knock Divine Shields off your opponent's board. After those, I would get into the really optional department, and I would say things like Monstrous Macaw are a pretty good fit. Reason for that being is Monstrous Macaw, especially if you're running 2 Nightbanes, you can get at least one of those triggers off every time. That's going to give you more attack flying around. You don't want to keep Macaw for long if you can help it, but it definitely is a good temporary fit. And a good fill-in for one of the higher tier dragons, Hoarding Hatespawner is not bad. It's a 10/10 that's going to, at the start of combat, eat stats off an opponent's board. If it's next to your Persistent Poet, it's going to retain those stats. If you golden it, it's going to get 20/20 buff. So definitely can fit on your board. It does do a decent amount of stats to start when you first get it, if you get it early enough. I'm not excited about this. I would never tier 2/6 get this. If I triple into an Amber Guardian while I'm at tier 4, I don't care. I'm probably never going to go to 5 unless I really want that Yu'lon, but I would certainly encourage you not to go to 5 or to 6 to find a Hoarding Hatespawn. If you get it, great, but don't work too hard for it. It's not really going to help you that much. And that's this build in the end. There's a lot of RNG involved in this build because you have a lot of triggers that are happening that you know exactly were going to land, but then you have the Nightbanes throwing around just massive amounts of attack that if they land on the wrong minion, you get no permanent value. But if they land on the right minion, oh, it's amazing. Definitely a fun build to play with. The only real weakness of this build is its lack of health gain. It doesn't gain a whole lot of health So you are very susceptible to token beast and undead boards, tunnel blasters, things like that can really mess up your game. Amber Guardian is an absolute must if you're going to be competitive at all in most lobbies. That way your minions can actually take a punch. That's it. That's dragons. That's how you build them. That's how you play them. That's the combos we like to use. What do you think? How would you play them? Do you play them different? Do you have a combo we didn't mention here, or perhaps a certain trick that we just never thought of? Please let us know in the comments below. Let me know if you like these videos, what you'd like to see different. Always, I will consider anything. No promises, but I try everything. Thank you very much, all. I hope you had a good time. I'll catch you next time. Later.